What do you think? Is it a good thing that more police officers in Thames Valley Force and in Hertfordshire are going to be armed with tasers? Or would you like to see them all armed with tasers? Pick up the phone, 08459 455 555. You can text me as well, 81333. Start your text with 3CR. Texts are charged at standard network rate. Let's hear the arguments, both for and against their use. Not everyone is in favour. Richard Taylor campaigns against the use of tasers. He lives in Cambridge, where 120 more officers have been trained to use them. Hello, Richard.
Good morning.
What's your problem with them?
Well, one of the things that we're seeing is we're seeing the tasers now being deployed to neighbourhood officers and more response officers, whereas previously it was only the highly trained and experienced specialist firearms units who had them. Now, I'm very happy for the specialist firearms units to have them as an alternative to a conventional firearm. What I don't want to see is neighbourhood police having them as a matter of routine.
Why not?
Well, because I think
they're the ones on the ground having to deal with these revolting criminals.
Well, I think it really changes the nature of policing in this country if we go down that road. I think it might create more of a battle between the police and the public, and I think it's a question for all of us to what degree do we want to see our policing armed, and to what degree do we want to go down a road of having policing by force rather than the traditional policing by consent that we've seen in this country.
But aren't you harping back to the days of, Dixon of Dock Green? You want to see police officers cycling down the pavement with a whistle and expecting their whistle to stop the perpetrator of the crime.
Well, I don't want to go that far back, but I certainly might want to go a little bit further back, because one of the things that we've got, which is the background to this change, is the cuts to policing budgets. And what we've seen is things like dog units merged between various forces, and we've seen firearms units merged. So these kinds of resources are not available as rapidly as they really should be. And I don't think that giving tasers to more of these neighbourhood police officers is an adequate response to that. I would have rather seen us keep the police dogs, keep the armed police available rapidly.
But tasers don't kill people, do they?
Well, when a police officer fires a taser at someone, they don't know what's going to happen next. When you lose all voluntary control over your muscles, you can't control how you fall and how you might injure yourself when you fall. And there have also been cases where people are ill or they're on drugs and they get tasered, and of course the police officer doesn't know
But you're not going to use a taser, I would imagine, as a police officer. You're not going to use a taser unless you feel it's absolutely necessary, in the same way that you wouldn't use a baton unless it was absolutely necessary. Well, the same argument you've just used for not having a taser is surely exactly the same as a baton. When you club someone over their head with a baton, you don't know whether they're going to fall unconscious, whether they're going to grab it off you and hit you back. All these things are unknown. It's down to the police officer at that time to use their own sound judgment.
Well, exactly what I want to see is proportionate use of force by our police. My concern is that if more police officers have got taser weapons, and this is what we've seen where the tasers have been issued to neighbourhood police and frontline police elsewhere, is that they get used more. And I would question, are we really seeing more violent incidents, or are we seeing the police response changing? And actually, I think the taser is a little bit different, because if a police officer is attempting to use a proportionate amount of force, I don't think it's as easy when you're just pressing a button, pulling a trigger on the taser, and they can keep their finger on the trigger of the taser for as long as they like until the battery runs out. Whereas I think you really know what you're doing when you
smashing someone over their head with a baton.
Using a baton, yes.
OK, well, let's stay where you are. Let me bring Roger Gray, who's a former firearms officer and author of Target Trojan, which is inspired by his experience of counter-terrorism, into the conversation. Hello, Roger.
Hello there.
Hi. Do you agree with what Richard's saying? He seems there's some pretty major concerns about giving all police officers a taser.
Well, I can understand his concerns, and I can understand the terms in which he's expressing them. But what doesn't really stack up is, first of all, the more widespread use of tasers is going to be obviously a consequence of their availability. But the question that arises then, is it right to use them more in a given set of circumstances? And I think, looked at it in that way, it is. Because it just means that officers have been, if they're properly trained and they use them correctly, they have been in a position to deal with a situation by that means where they wouldn't otherwise have been able to do so. And for all we know, the consequences in any given incident might have been worse had the taser not been there. You know, nothing is risk-free. As you yourself quite rightly pointed out, in any violent exchange, which is what we are discussing here, even the exercise of arrest is a degree of violence to some extent, there can be unwanted consequences. And I would suggest that the likelihood of unwanted consequences rather, are far less where a taser is being used than in many other circumstances. Certainly, where it's viable to use a taser as opposed to a conventional firearm to disarm someone who is armed or otherwise so dangerous, then it's infinitely preferable.
Richard, does it not concern you the level of violence, the level of nastiness that is going on in some of the crimes happening all over Beds, Herts and Bucks? I mean, for example, I understand we now have increasing numbers of gangs, and these are not just, you know, a small bunch of hoodies hanging around. We're talking about bandana gangs certainly in parts of Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire. They are ruling estates, they are ruining people's lives, and they are, I think to use the technical expression, they are tooled up. They are ready, where they have knives, they have metal batons, to send the police into those estates to deal with those kinds of criminals without something effective to disarm them, which a taser seems to be perfectly useful for. It seems very naive.
Well, that does concern me an awful lot. And what I don't want to see is, as a response to the police in increasing the amount of weaponry that they've got, the criminals doing so as well.
But it's too late. They're already doing it.
Well, we're already seeing people bringing in electric shock weapons into the country, using cattle stun devices, which are a bit like police tasers. And I think we should be going in the other direction. We should be trying to de-weaponise from both sides. So we shouldn't be ramping up what the police have got, which will then encourage criminals and others to ramp up what they're using.
Is that true, Roger, that all you do when you give more police officers tasers is give more criminals weapons?
No, I don't agree. I mean, please forgive me if I say that Richard is being a little naive here, and I don't mean that with any disrespect. But what you're seeing in any given circumstance is that the police have to respond to the threat that they are being presented with, and that, I think, is what we are seeing here. The presence of other means of violence or other kinds of weapons in this country is not a direct response to whatever the police do. It's a direct response to the way the current trend is going, and the police are in turn responding to that. So, you know, they have to be equal to the task. If we go back in history and think about things like when there have been attacks with samurai swords, etc., rare that it is, but the awful weapon that they are, police have not been in a consequence to respond. There was an MP, I think, that was seriously injured or killed as a consequence of that. We do hear of these things. You know, if there had been a taser present at that time, would that situation have been diffused? Have people in the past that have been shot, in given circumstances, that happened again now, could we now avoid that? You know, we've got to look at the broader picture and see where the percentages stack up.
Richard?
Well, my concern is also the safety of the police and the public, and I think that we would be safer if we kept tasers in the hands only of the highly experienced and well-trained firearms units. I think that would be the best route to go down. And I do want to see that the police have the resources they need. I'm very happy when I go to a major airport or a mainline train station in London and you see armed police walking around. Where it's in response to the threat, I'm very happy. But I'm not convinced that actually this rollout of taser towards more and more police officers is actually in response to the situation. I think it's the police unilaterally changing their stance, changing the way that they're policing this country.
I think it's being driven by incident. I don't think we can avoid this. I have great sympathy with what you're saying, and I prefer the image of the traditional police officer. I prefer not to see reflective vests and so on and so forth. But, you know, times have changed. I don't particularly want to see, you know, the bright colours of a taser worn on the hip of every police officer around the streets, but, you know, we have to accept that things have moved on and, you know, we may have to digest this. the presence of armed police officers in our society has become very largely accepted now, and doesn't really raise an eyebrow even down in the high street anymore. People are kind of used to it. You know, we have to go with changes that are occurring. If you go back into history, far enough back, you'll find that there was greater access to weapons in, say, in the Victorian era and the early last century than they've been in recent history. You know, the use of a pistol or a firearm, or even further back, a cutlass could be booked out for night duty. Things have changed. Things are changing again. We do have to accept it. Unfortunately, it's inevitable.
Listen, very interesting hearing both of your arguments. Thank you very much indeed for your time. There's Richard Taylor and Roger Gray, who's a former firearms officer and author of Target Trojan, which is inspired by his experience in counter-terrorism.